Long before the pyramids of Egypt, before the columns of Greece or the roads of Rome, the first civilization rose in a land between two rivers. This region, whose name means between the rivers in ancient Greek, was nestled between the Tigris and Euphrates. These waterways flowed from the mountains of eastern Turkey to the Persian Gulf, creating fertile plains in what is now modern Iraq. On these plains, humanity first gathered in cities, developed writing, established laws, and contemplated the cosmos. The fundamental patterns of urban life emerged from this fertile soil. This history spans from 10,000 BC, when the first settlements appeared after the Ice Age, to 539 BC, when Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon. Kings built empires of mud brick and bronze. Scribes pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay tablets, and architects raised ziggurats to reach their gods. Their records, preserved in humble clay, have outlasted many grander monuments. The first chapter of civilization began in the Fertile Crescent as the ice retreated and humans established the foundations of organized society. As the last ice age retreated around the 10th millennium BC, the climate of Southwest Asia began to warm. The frozen grip that had constrained human potential for millennia gradually loosened. In the hills and valleys surrounding the twin rivers, small bands of hunter-gatherers noticed something remarkable: wild wheat and barley growing in abundance. These early people had spent countless generations following herds and gathering seasonal plants. They carried their possessions on their backs and moved with the rhythms of nature. But now, in this changing world, they began to linger in places where food was plentiful. The first settlements were modest, clusters of round huts made from reeds and mud. At sites like Tel Moribet and Abu Huraira in what is now northern Syria, archaeological evidence shows people beginning to establish permanent homes. They still hunted gazelle and gathered wild pistachios, but they stayed in one place season after season. In the Jordan Valley, one settlement grew into something unprecedented. Jericho, perhaps the world's oldest continuously inhabited town, emerged 11,000 years ago. Its inhabitants built stone walls, not just for homes, but for protection. The first evidence of communal defense. They crafted mysterious tower structures whose purpose remains debated by archaeologists today. Further east, at Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, another remarkable community developed. Here, people built their mud brick houses so close together that they had no streets. Residents entered their homes through holes in the roof, moving across the settlement like ants through a complex mound. But the true revolution was happening quietly in the fields. Through careful observation and selection, these early farmers began to domesticate wild grains. Plants with larger seeds and husks that didn't shatter easily were favored. Generation after generation, wild grass became cultivated wheat. The deliberate growing of food had begun. Similarly, animals once hunted became herded. The wild aurochs, fierce ancestors of modern cattle, were gradually tamed. Sheep, goats, and pigs followed. The domestication of animals provided a reliable source of meat, milk, and hides without the uncertainties of the hunt. This agricultural revolution spread gradually along the fertile arc of land, stretching from the Persian Gulf, up through the river valleys, and around to the Mediterranean coast, the Fertile Crescent. The transformation was not instant, but unfolded across centuries. The implications were profound. For the first time, humans could produce more food than they immediately needed. This surplus allowed some individuals to pursue crafts other than food production. Specialists emerged, potters, weavers, and tool makers, who could trade their creations for food. During the 6th millennium BC, another pivotal innovation appeared: pottery. Those simple containers had been made from stone, wood, and woven reeds for millennia. The firing of clay created vessels that were both lightweight and watertight. Food could be stored longer, liquids could be transported easily. As crops became more productive, early farming communities discovered a new challenge. In the lowland plains between the rivers, rainfall was scarce, but the annual flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates provided rich silt for growing. The people learned to dig channels to direct this water to their fields. The birth of irrigation, agriculture. By the early 5th millennium BC, small villages had grown into larger settlements across the southern alluvial plain, the land that would later be called Sumer. Sites like Eridu and Uruk began as modest farming communities, but would eventually grow into something new: true cities. The management of water became central to these developing societies. Coordinating irrigation required leadership and organization beyond the family unit. Communal projects to build canals and dikes fostered more complex social structures. With agriculture came new challenges. Food surpluses needed protection from raiders and management for lean times. Religious beliefs evolved to address the uncertainties of farming life. The forces controlling rain, flood, and drought became personified as deities requiring propitiation. Temples began as simple shrines, but grew more elaborate. Nearly 6,000 years ago, some communities were constructing dedicated buildings where specialists, early priests, performed rituals to ensure good harvests. These temples became centers not just of worship but of redistribution, where grain was collected and dispensed. Social stratification increased. Those who controlled the surpluses gained power. Those who interpreted the will of the gods gained authority. The egalitarianism of hunter-gatherer bands gave way to hierarchical communities with emerging elites. Tools evolved as well. Copper, first used for beads and decorative items around 7 millennia BC, began to be shaped into more practical implements. 1,000 years later, metal workers had discovered that copper mixed with tin created bronze, harder and more durable than pure copper. The Bronze Age had begun. Trade networks expanded dramatically. Obsidian from Anatolian volcanoes was highly prized for its sharp edges and traveled hundreds of miles from its source. Lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan found its way to temple ornaments in the southern plains. Shells from the Persian Gulf appeared in inland settlements. Toward the end of the 4th millennium BC, in the city of Uruk, another momentous development occurred. Facing the growing complexity of managing temple resources, administrators began using clay tokens to represent quantities of goods. These tokens eventually evolved into marks pressed into clay tablets, the world's first writing system. Initially, these marks were simple pictographs, drawings representing the items being counted. A picture of a sheep meant a sheep. Multiple sheep were indicated by multiple marks, but gradually, the system became more abstract. Marks came to represent not just things, but sounds, the birth of true writing. By the dawn of the 4th millennium BC, the foundations of civilization, as we understand it, were in place. Cities with thousands of inhabitants, specialized crafts and professions, monumental architecture, complex religious institutions, social stratification, long-distance trade, and written records. The stage was set for the next chapter in this remarkable story: the rise of the Sumerians and the world's first true urban civilization. the southern alluvial plain, where the twin rivers approached the sea, became the heartland of humanity's first true civilization. Here, amid marshy deltas and fertile fields, a remarkable culture created something unprecedented in human history: a network of genuine cities, each housing thousands of inhabitants within their mud-brick walls. Uruk, perhaps the most magnificent of these early urban centers, expanded rapidly after 3500 BC. Archaeological excavations reveal a settlement that eventually covered nearly 250 hectares and may have housed up to 50,000 people at its peak. Massive defensive walls enclosed neighborhoods of densely packed houses, workshops, marketplaces, and administrative buildings. At the heart of Uruk stood its crowning architectural achievement, the White Temple. Perched atop a towering platform, this sacred structure rose like a mountain from the flat plain. Its whitewashed walls gleamed in the desert sun, visible for miles across the landscape. This platform, an early prototype of what would later develop into the classic ziggurat, demonstrated both engineering prowess and religious devotion. Other urban centers emerged across the landscape. Nestled near the ancient coastline, now far inland, due to millennia of silt deposition, became a bustling port city. Eridu, considered by local tradition to be the oldest city, housed a temple complex dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water. Lagash, Kish, Nippur, and Umma grew into powerful city-states, each with its own distinct identity, ruling dynasty, and patron deity. These cities were not simply large villages. They represented a fundamentally new form of human organization. Unlike earlier settlements, they housed diverse specialists, not just farmers, but metal workers, potters, weavers, merchants, administrators, soldiers, and priests. Each city's architecture revealed its complex social organization, with imposing temples, administrative buildings, grand houses for elites, and modest quarters for commoners. The development of monumental architecture transformed the landscape. Temples evolved from simple shrines into elaborate multi-room complexes atop massive elevated platforms. These early ziggurats, though not yet achieving the stepped pyramid form of later periods, nonetheless dominated the skyline. By 3000 BC, the city of featured a temple platform over 11 meters high, requiring more than 720,000 baked bricks for its construction. The question of who directed these monumental construction projects reveals another innovation of this society: institutionalized leadership. Early governance appears to have been a form of shared authority. Councils of elders and assemblies of citizens held significant power, but religious leaders who controlled the temple resources gradually assumed greater authority, becoming priest-kings, or en, in the local tongue. These early rulers derived legitimacy from their special relationship with the gods. They served as intermediaries between the divine and human realms. In times of crisis, war, flood, or drought, a temporary military leader might be appointed. These Lugal, literally meaning big man, sometimes parlayed their emergency powers into permanent kingship, gradually supplanting the authority of priests. By 2900 BC, kingship had become firmly established in most cities of the region. Kings claimed divine sanction, though not yet divine status themselves. Royal tombs from this period at display extraordinary wealth: gold vessels, elaborate jewelry, musical instruments, and the skeletons of retainers apparently sacrificed to accompany their ruler into the afterlife. Religious beliefs permeated every aspect of life in these early city-states. The pantheon included countless deities, with each city elevating its patron god or goddess to special prominence. An, the sky god, Enlil, the god of wind and storms, Enki, the god of water and wisdom, and Inanna, the goddess of love and war, ranked among the most powerful. The people believed these gods were much like humans in their emotions and needs, though vastly more powerful. Temples functioned as the gods' earthly dwellings, where priests performed elaborate rituals to please these divine residents. Daily offerings of food, drink, and incense sustained the deities, who might otherwise unleash flood, famine, or invasion upon neglectful worshippers. The cosmos was pictured as a flat disk with the earth at its center, covered by a vault of heaven. Below lay the underworld, a gloomy realm where the spirits of the dead existed in a shadowy half-life. Unlike later civilizations, there was no promise of paradise for the virtuous. The afterlife awaited everyone, regardless of earthly conduct, as a dimmer version of mortal existence. The understanding of the natural world blended practical observation with mythological explanation. Medical texts from this period show sophisticated knowledge of anatomy and treatments, yet attribute disease to divine displeasure or demonic influence. Similarly, advanced astronomy tracked celestial movements for agricultural and religious calendars, while interpreting unusual cosmic events as divine omens. One of the most far-reaching innovations of this culture, cuneiform writing, continued to evolve throughout this period. What began as simple pictograms for accounting gradually developed into a comprehensive writing system, capable of expressing abstract concepts and recording spoken language. By 2500 BC, scribes were using about 600 different signs to write, not just lists of goods, but letters, legal documents, medical texts, and literature. Literacy remained the privilege of a specialized class of scribes. Young boys from wealthy families began training in the tablet houses, their schools, around age 7, studying for years to master the complex system. These scribes gained considerable status, serving as administrators, accountants, and record keepers for temples, palaces, and merchants. The language of this early civilization remains somewhat mysterious. Unrelated to the Semitic or Indo-European language families, it stands as a linguistic isolate with no known relatives. Its distinctive grammar and sound system were eventually preserved in cuneiform when later peoples adapted the writing system to their own tongues. Literature, preserved on thousands of clay tablets, reveals a rich cultural tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though compiled in its classic form during a later period, originated in tales about a historical king of Uruk, who ruled around 2700 BC. This remarkable story follows its hero's quest for immortality after the death of his beloved friend, ultimately concluding that death is humanity's inevitable fate. Other important works include creation myths, explaining how the gods fashioned humans from clay to be their servants, hymns praising deities and kings, and wisdom literature offering practical and moral advice. One poignant text, Man and His God, wrestles with the problem of undeserved suffering, resembling in some ways the later biblical book of Job. This civilization also created the world's oldest known law codes, though the famous Code of Hammurabi would come later. Fragments of legal texts from around 2400 BC show a society already concerned with formalizing rules for commerce, property, marriage, and criminal justice. One collection, the Laws of Ornamu, established monetary compensation for injuries rather than the principle of physical retribution. The concept of an eye for an eye, found in later Semitic law codes. Economic life in these ancient cities revolved around the temples and palaces, which controlled vast agricultural estates, Temples employed thousands of workers to farm their lands, tend livestock, and produce textiles. These institutions developed sophisticated accounting systems, tracking income, expenditures, loans, and interest payments. Private commerce also flourished. Merchant families conducted trade expeditions to distant lands, exchanging grain, textiles, and manufactured goods for timber, metals, and luxury items. By the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, trade networks extended to the Indus Valley Civilization in what is now Pakistan, to the highlands of Iran and Afghanistan, to Anatolia, and down the Persian Gulf. Technological innovation accelerated during this period. The potter's wheel, appearing around 3500 BC, revolutionized ceramic production. Wheeled vehicles, first evidenced around 3200 BC, transformed transportation. Bronze metallurgy advanced significantly, producing stronger tools and weapons. Mathematical knowledge grew more sophisticated, developing a sexagesimal number system based on units of 60, whose legacy survives in our 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles. While the urban revolution transformed society, most people remained farmers, living in the countryside or in the shadow of city walls. Their agricultural techniques became increasingly sophisticated. They developed specialized plows, irrigation systems with regulatory gates and levees, and methods for combating the increasing salinization of over-irrigated fields. The social hierarchy grew more complex as cities expanded. At the top stood kings, priests, and nobles. Below them ranked the professionals, scribes, merchants, and master craftsmen. The bulk of the urban population consisted of ordinary craft workers, laborers, and servants. At the bottom stood slaves. Though slavery was not as pervasive as in some later civilizations, and often represented a temporary status caused by debt or wartime capture, women in this society held more rights than in many later civilizations. They could own property, operate businesses, and even serve as scribes or priestesses, though the highest religious and political offices remained male domains. Marriage was arranged by families, typically with a bride price paid to the woman's parents. Divorce was possible for both partners under certain circumstances, though men had greater freedom in this regard. The city-states of this region existed in a near-constant state of competition and conflict. Disputes over water rights, boundary lines, and trade routes frequently escalated into warfare. Around 2500 BC, the ruler of Umma, Lugalzagesi, conquered several neighboring cities and briefly unified much of the southern plain. His achievement proved short-lived, however, setting the stage for external conquest. By 2334 BC, the political landscape of Mesopotamia stood poised for transformation. The independent city-states had developed sophisticated culture, technology, and social organization, but their internal rivalries left them vulnerable. To the north, in the region around modern Baghdad, a leader with unprecedented ambition was rising to power. Sargon of Akkad, who would create the world's first true empire. The legacy of this remarkable civilization would live on in the imperial systems that followed. As later peoples adopted and adapted its religious concepts, literary themes, artistic conventions, and scientific knowledge, even after losing political independence, the cultural influence of Sumer continued to shape Mesopotamian civilization for millennia. To the north of the ancient city-states of Sumer, another culture had been developing in the central plains of Mesopotamia. These peoples spoke a Semitic language rather than the isolated tongue of their southern neighbors. Though influenced by the achievements of the older civilization, they maintained their own distinct identity, centered around their main settlement, Akkad. The exact location of Akkad remains unknown to modern archaeologists, but it likely stood somewhere near present-day Baghdad. From this city would emerge a figure whose ambitions would transform the political landscape of the ancient world, Sargon, whose name means the true king in his native language. The origins of Sargon are shrouded in legend. According to his own inscriptions, he was born to humble beginnings, the son of a gardener or date palm cultivator. A later tradition claimed he was a foundling, set adrift in a reed basket on the Euphrates River, much like the biblical Moses would later be portrayed. Whatever his true background, Sargon began his career as a cupbearer to the king of Kish, an important northern city-state. From this modest position at court, Sargon demonstrated remarkable political and military skills. Around 2334 BC, he seized power in Kish through circumstances now lost to history. Having established this initial base of power, he turned his attention southward toward the wealthy cities of the southern plain. Lugalzajersi, the ruler from Umma, who had briefly united many southern cities under his control, became Sargon's chief rival. That clash represented more than a mere power struggle between ambitious leaders. It was a confrontation between two different models of state organization. Lugalzajersi sought to maintain the traditional city-state system with himself as paramount ruler, while Sargon envisioned something revolutionary, a unified territorial state under direct central control. In a series of military campaigns, Sargon defeated Lugalzajersi and the allied forces of the southern cities. One inscription claims he washed his weapons in the sea, suggesting his armies reached the Persian Gulf. The victorious northern ruler then instituted a radical new approach to governance. Instead of allowing conquered cities to maintain their autonomy under local dynasties who paid tribute, he removed their rulers and installed loyal officials, often members of his own family, as governors. This administrative innovation marked the birth of the world's first true empire, a multi-ethnic state with centralized authority extending over a vast territory. At its height, this empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, encompassing not only Mesopotamia, but parts of modern-day Syria, Turkey, and Iran. To bind this diverse realm together, Sargon implemented several unifying strategies. He established his native tongue as the official imperial language for administration. He standardized weights and measures to facilitate trade and taxation throughout the empire. Perhaps most importantly, he created a standing professional army, reportedly numbering 5,400 men who ate bread daily before him. This military force, loyal to the ruler rather than to local cities or leaders, provided the coercive power necessary to maintain imperial control. The empire's economic foundations rested on agricultural surplus extracted as taxes, control of vital trade routes, and the wealth of conquered cities. Trade expanded dramatically under imperial security, with caravans and ships carrying goods across unprecedented distances. Merchants from the empire ventured as far as the Indus Valley in modern Pakistan and into Central Asia, in search of precious materials like lapis lazuli, carnelian, and tin. For the common people, this imperial system brought both benefits and burdens. Imperial peace and standardization facilitated commerce and cultural exchange. New irrigation works increased agricultural productivity in some regions. However, taxation was heavy, and labor could be conscripted for massive building projects or military campaigns. Rebellions were punished harshly, With city walls demolished and populations sometimes relocated, Sargon ruled for approximately 56 years, according to later king lists, though this may include the reigns of some of his successors. His long reign provided the stability needed for imperial institutions to take root. When he died around 2279 BC, he left behind a transformed political landscape. The age of independent city-states had given way to the age of empires. His successors faced the perennial challenge of imperial rulers, maintaining control over diverse territories with different languages, cultures, and local interests. Rimush and Manishtushu, Sargon's sons, spent much of their reigns suppressing revolts. Both died violently, possibly assassinated, after relatively short reigns. Naram-Sin, Sargon's grandson, proved to be the most capable ruler of the dynasty after its founder. Ascending to the throne around 2254 BC, he further developed imperial administration and embarked on ambitious military campaigns. In response to a massive rebellion of several major cities, he demonstrated both military skill and ruthlessness, crushing the opposition and rebuilding his grandfather's empire. After these victories, Naram-Sin took an unprecedented step in Mesopotamian politics. He declared himself a god. Previous rulers had claimed to be divinely appointed or to rule on behalf of the gods. But Naram-Sin had his name written with the divine determinative, the cuneiform sign indicating a deity. Official art depicted him wearing the horned crown traditionally reserved for gods. This elevation of the ruler to divine status reflected both the extraordinary power of the imperial office and perhaps a strategy to strengthen loyalty in a multi-ethnic realm where local religious traditions varied. Naram-Sin's reign represented the zenith of imperial power. His famous victory, Stele, discovered at Susa in modern Iran, depicts him as a heroic figure, physically larger than his soldiers and trampling defeated enemies. The artistic conventions established during this period, showing the ruler as superhuman in scale and achievements, would influence royal iconography throughout the ancient Near East for centuries to come. Despite these impressive achievements, cracks were appearing in the imperial edifice. Maintaining control over such vast territories, with ancient transportation and communication technology, proved increasingly difficult. Provincial governors, often members of the royal family, developed their own power bases. The costs of constant military campaigns to suppress rebellions strained the economy. External pressure also intensified during this period. Inscriptions from Naram-Sin's reign mention conflicts with mountain peoples called the Guti, who raided from the Zagros Mountains to the east. From the northwest, the power of Ebla in Syria presented another challenge to imperial control. After Naram-Sin's death, around 2218 BCE, his son, Shar-Kali-Shari, inherited these mounting problems. Though a capable ruler who maintained imperial power for a time, the centrifugal forces pulling at the empire proved too strong. Provincial areas broke away, external enemies pressed in, and economic troubles deepened. A later text dramatically describes these troubled times. Who was king? Who was not king? Suggesting a period of disputed succession and fragmented authority. This time of confusion lasted until approximately 2154 BC, when the last nominal ruler of the dynasty was overthrown, bringing the empire to its end. Traditional Mesopotamian historical thought attributed this collapse to divine punishment for Naram-Sin's pride and his sack of the holy city of Nippur. Modern historians identify more concrete factors: the ecological strain of intensive agriculture, the administrative challenge of controlling vast territories, economic difficulties, and the constant pressure of surrounding peoples. After the fall of the empire, various successor states emerged across the region. In the southern cities, local rulers reasserted their independence. In the north, the Guti, mountain people from the Zagros range, established control over parts of the former imperial heartland. The cultural impact of this first empire outlasted its political structures. The fusion of northern and southern traditions created a blended Mesopotamian culture that would influence the region for centuries. The imperial ideal, a unified state under a single ruler, became a recurring aspiration for ambitious leaders. The prestige of Sargon's dynasty remained so powerful that later rulers, including Assyrian kings nearly 2,000 years later, would claim connection to this first empire to legitimize their own rule. Even in decline, the accomplishments of this pioneering imperial state left an indelible mark on history. The organizational innovations, cultural exchanges, and political concepts developed during this period provided models for future empires, not only in Mesopotamia, but across the ancient world. Though the empire itself proved relatively short-lived, lasting less than 2 centuries, its legacy would endure for millennia as the template for imperial states to come. Following the collapse of the world's first empire, a period of fragmentation ensued across the lands between the rivers. The mountain-dwelling Guti seized control of northern territories, while southern city-states regained independence under local leaders. This interlude of disunity lasted for nearly a century. The Guti, described in contemporary texts as the dragon of the mountains and a people who know no inhibitions, maintained loose control over the north, but never established sophisticated administrative structures. Their rule, characterized by raids and tribute collection, rather than governance, grew increasingly unpopular among the settled populations under their dominion. Meanwhile, in the south, a remarkable cultural renaissance began taking shape. Freed from northern control, yet drawing on the integrated traditions developed during the previous era, the ancient cities experienced a creative rebirth. Scholars call this phase the Neo-Sumerian period, marking the revitalization of older cultural forms within new political structures. Among these resurgent southern centers, the city of Lagash achieved particular prominence under a ruler named Gudea. Though never attempting to build a large territorial state, Gudea presided over a flourishing of arts, architecture, and religious expression. Dozens of statues depicting this pious leader have survived, showing him in poses of devotion with hands clasped in prayer. Made from hard diorite stone imported from distant lands, these sculptures demonstrate both artistic sophistication and extensive trade connections. Inscriptions left by Gudea describe elaborate temple construction projects and religious devotion. One text recounts a dream in which the god Ningirsu instructed him to rebuild a temple, complete with detailed divine specifications. This literary account of divine architectural plans represents one of the most extensive religious texts from the period. While Lagash flourished culturally, a different city would soon emerge as the political center of a renewed territorial state. Uruk, an ancient settlement near the Persian Gulf, became the seat of a new dynasty, founded by a ruler named Ur-Nammu, around 2112 BC. This capable leader drove out the Guti from the north and reunited much of the former imperial territory, though on a somewhat smaller scale. Unlike the previous empire builders who emphasized military conquest and centralization through force, Ur-Nammu established his reputation primarily as a lawgiver and builder. The law code bearing his name, though only partially preserved, stands as the earliest known systematic legal collection in history, predating the more famous Code of Hammurabi by more than 3 centuries. This pioneering legal text established fixed monetary penalties for various offenses, moving away from physical retribution towards standardized compensation. It protected the less powerful, widows, orphans, and the poor, from exploitation by the wealthy. Notably, the code included the earliest known traffic laws, establishing right-of-way rules for boats on canals. Beyond his legal innovations, Ur-Nammu embarked on an ambitious building program throughout his domains. His most visible achievement was the construction of monumental ziggurats, massive step temples rising toward the heavens. The best preserved example at Uruk featured 3 levels, reaching a height of about 30 meters, accessed by triple staircases. These imposing structures, visible for miles across the flat landscape, served as potent symbols of renewed cultural confidence and religious devotion. The administrative system, developed during this period, represented a sophisticated blend of centralized and local control. Provincial governors oversaw regional affairs, while a complex bureaucracy managed the collection and redistribution of resources. Royal officials conducted regular tours of inspection, and messengers carried communications along designated routes between administrative centers. Under Ur-Nammu's son, Shulgi, who ruled for an extraordinary 48 years, the state reached its peak of organization and prosperity. This long-reigning monarch implemented numerous innovations that strengthened central governance while respecting local traditions. He established a standardized calendar, reformed weights and measures, created a royal messenger system with posting stations, reorganized the tax system, and standardized scribal education. Shulgi also cultivated his image as an ideal ruler through various symbolic actions. He claimed to be a champion runner who personally carried ritual offerings between major temple cities in a single day, a distance of over 100 miles. Whether literal or symbolic, this claim emphasized his role in unifying distant centers through personal exertion. In the later years of his reign, Shulgi followed the precedent established by earlier rulers and declared himself divine. Temples dedicated to his cult were established throughout the realm, and his name was written with the divine determinative. This deification of the living king represented an attempt to create a religious foundation for political unity across traditionally independent cities. The economic system of this period combined centralized planning with market elements. The state controlled vast agricultural estates, employed thousands of workers directly, and managed extensive redistribution networks. Textile workshops housed hundreds of female workers, producing goods for both domestic consumption and export. Simultaneously, private merchants conducted independent trade ventures, though typically under royal oversight. Cultural achievements during this era included a revival of the ancient language for religious and literary purposes. Scribal schools flourished, preserving and expanding traditional texts. Many of the literary works later identified as classics were compiled and standardized during this period of cultural renaissance, including creation myths, temple hymns, royal praise poems, and wisdom literature. One innovative literary form that emerged was the royal love song. Lyrical compositions depicting romantic relationships between kings and the goddess Inanna. These poems, mixing politics with eroticism, served to reinforce the theological underpinnings of royal authority through divine marriage metaphors. A hymn about Shulgi describes him as the beloved husband of Inanna, symbolically linking political and cosmic order. International relations during this period included both diplomatic and military dimensions. Royal marriages cemented alliances with neighboring powers, Trade networks extended to distant lands, bringing luxury goods from as far as the Indus Valley and Afghanistan. Military campaigns secured frontiers and trade routes, particularly against nomadic peoples from the eastern highlands and deserts, who periodically threatened settled areas. The stability of this Renaissance period began to erode under Shulgi's successes. Ibbi Sin, the last ruler of the dynasty, faced mounting challenges from several directions. Provincial governors increasingly acted as independent rulers, withholding tax revenues and eventually declaring outright independence. Amorite nomadic groups infiltrated from the west, establishing settlements in previously urban-dominated areas. Most critically, the ancient irrigation systems that sustained the agricultural heartland faced a combination of drought conditions and the cumulative effects of salinization, a process where repeated irrigation in an arid climate leads to salt buildup in the soil, gradually reducing fertility. Grain prices recorded in texts from this period show dramatic inflation, suggesting severe agricultural difficulties. A correspondence between Ibbi Sin and a provincial governor named Ishbi-Era illustrates the deteriorating situation. The governor reports being unable to deliver grain shipments due to threats from enemies, likely both external nomadic groups and internal rebellious elements. Eventually, Ishbi-Era established himself as an independent ruler in the city of Isin, effectively seceding from the unified state. The final blow came from an external power. The neighboring state of Elam, centered in what is now southwestern Iran, had grown increasingly powerful. Around 2004 BC, Elamite forces allied with other enemies of the regime captured Uruk itself. The city was pillaged, its ziggurat desecrated, and Ibbi Sin taken captive to Elam, where he presumably died in exile. A contemporary lament describes the fall of Uruk in poignant terms. The city has been defiled, its people live like ghosts. The treasuries have been pillaged. Corpses float in the Euphrates, which once brought life. This literary work, combining historical report with theological interpretation, viewed the destruction as divine punishment for human failings. Though politically devastating, the fall of Ur did not erase the cultural achievements of this Renaissance period. The legal concepts, literary works, administrative techniques, and architectural forms developed during this creative era would continue to influence Mesopotamian civilization for centuries to come. As one era ended, the stage was set for new political configurations in the land between the rivers. After the collapse of the Ur dynasty, political power in Mesopotamia fragmented among numerous competing city-states. No single center could establish dominance, resulting in a patchwork of small kingdoms vying for control of trade routes, water access, and agricultural lands. This period of division, lasting nearly a century, saw the emergence of several notable regional powers, including Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and Mari. A significant demographic shift accompanied this political fragmentation. Semi-nomadic peoples, known as Amorites, originally from the Syrian desert regions, had been gradually infiltrating the settled lands of Mesopotamia for generations. Speaking a Western Semitic language, different from both the ancient Southern tongue and the Eastern Semitic dialect of the First Empire, these newcomers established dynasties in several cities. One such Amorite leader, named Sumwarbum, established himself in a previously minor settlement called Babylon around 1894 BC. Located on the Euphrates River in central Mesopotamia, this city, whose name meant Gate of the Gods, had existed for centuries without particular distinction. Under its new ruling house, however, it would gradually rise to unprecedented prominence. For its first century, Under Amorite leadership, Babylon remained merely one power, among many, in the fragmented political landscape. The city's first 5 rulers expanded their territory gradually, building fortifications, temples, and irrigation works to strengthen their modest kingdom. Still, other cities, like Larsa and Isin, commanded greater resources and prestige during this early phase. The geopolitical situation shifted dramatically with the accession of the 6th ruler of the dynasty, a king who would transform both his city and the entire region through military prowess, administrative genius, and careful image building. Taking the throne around 1792 BC, this monarch, Hammurabi, would rule for 43 years and establish Babylon as the dominant center of Mesopotamian civilization. Early in his reign, Hammurabi focused on internal development, strengthening Babylon's infrastructure and economic foundations. Irrigation canals were extended, temples renovated, and city walls reinforced. The young ruler carefully cultivated relationships with neighboring powers, sometimes acting as mediator in their disputes, while avoiding direct confrontation until his position was secure. Around the middle of his reign, having consolidated his base, Hammurabi embarked on a series of military campaigns that systematically eliminated rival centers of power. First targeting southern cities like Uruk and Isin, he gradually extended his control throughout the region. Each conquest was followed by careful integration of the defeated territory into his growing kingdom. One by one, the other major powers fell to Babylonian forces. Larsa, which had controlled much of the south, Eshnunna in the Diyala region, Mari on the middle Euphrates, and finally Asha, the northern trading center that would later give rise to the Assyrian Empire. By the end of this campaign, Hammurabi had united virtually all of Mesopotamia under a single rule for the first time since the collapse of the First Empire 5 centuries earlier. Unlike earlier conquerors who emphasized the revolutionary nature of their rule, Hammurabi presented himself as a conservative restorer of ancient traditions. His royal inscriptions describe him as the king who made the 4 quarters of the world obedient, but also as a shepherd appointed by the gods to bring justice to the land. This emphasis on justice found its most famous expression in the set of laws compiled under his authority. The Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a 2.25-meter-tall stone stele, crowned with an image of the king, receiving authority from the sun, god Shamash, contained 282 legal provisions covering virtually every aspect of society. This monument, discovered by modern archaeologists in 1901, stands as one of the most complete legal collections from the ancient world. The laws themselves reveal a complex society with clearly defined social classes. Different penalties applied depending on whether the parties involved were aristocrats, commoners, or slaves. Principles like an eye for an eye applied when both parties were of equal status, but monetary compensation was prescribed when a higher status person injured someone of lower rank. Despite this class-based approach, the code repeatedly emphasized protection for the vulnerable, to prevent the strong from oppressing the weak, to provide justice for the orphan and widow. The collection addressed everything from property disputes and inheritance to marriage and divorce, from professional standards for doctors and builders to agricultural contracts and commercial regulations. While often portrayed as a lawgiver in both ancient and modern accounts, Hammurabi was equally active as an administrator and economic manager. His government maintained detailed records of agricultural production, labor allocation, and resource distribution. Royal officials supervised irrigation systems, allocated state lands, set prices for basic commodities, and regulated trade. Hundreds of surviving letters, dictated by the king himself, reveal his hands-on approach to governance. He personally addressed complaints from distant provinces, investigated charges of corruption among local officials, and micromanaged religious ceremonies and building projects. This combination of grand strategy and administrative detail characterized his leadership style. In religious matters, Hammurabi elevated Babylon's patron deity Marduk from local status to a position of prominence in the regional pantheon. While continuing to honor traditional gods like Enlil, Shamash, and Ishtar, royal propaganda increasingly presented Marduk as the king of the gods, mirroring Babylon's new political supremacy. The king also positioned himself as divinely chosen, though stopping short of the outright self-deification attempted by some earlier rulers. The prologue to his lore code describes him as named by Anu and Enlil to promote the welfare of the people, to cause justice to prevail in the land. This balance between divine sanction and human service characterized Babylonian royal ideology. When Hammurabi died around 1750 BC, he left behind a unified kingdom incorporating most of Mesopotamia. His son, Samsu-iluna, inherited a seemingly stable state, but this appearance proved deceptive. Within a few years, revolts erupted in southern cities with older cultural traditions. Though initially suppressed, these rebellions continued to flare up, gradually eroding central control. Adding to these internal challenges, a new external threat emerged from the marshlands of the extreme south. A people known as the Sealand dynasty established control over the coastal regions, eventually seizing several southern cities from Babylonian control. Simultaneously, mountain peoples from the Zagros range began making incursions along the eastern frontiers. Under these mounting pressures, Babylon's territorial control gradually contracted. By 1700 BC, just 50 years after Hammurabi's death, much of the south had been lost. Subsequent rulers maintained control over central Mesopotamia, but never regained the extensive empire of their great predecessor. Despite this territorial reduction, Babylon itself remained prosperous and culturally dominant. The city grew to cover nearly 450 hectares, housing perhaps 60,000 to 80,000 inhabitants. Its temples, palaces, and commercial districts made it one of the ancient world's greatest urban centers. Babylonian culture during this period synthesized older traditions while developing distinctive new forms. Scholars compiled and preserved ancient texts, including literary works, medical treatises, mathematical texts, and religious compositions. The Akkadian language of Babylon became the international diplomatic tongue of the Near East, used for communication between kingdoms across the region. Intellectual achievements flourished, particularly in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Babylonian astronomers carefully tracked celestial movements, developing the first predictive mathematical models of planetary behavior. Mathematicians worked with an advanced numeral system that permitted complex calculations, including operations with fractions, solving of quadratic equations, and early approximations of irrational numbers, like the square root of 2. This creative period continued for nearly 2 centuries after Hammurabi. Despite the gradual reduction in Babylon's territorial control, the dynasty maintained political stability within its core regions, and cultural influence extended far beyond political boundaries. The end came suddenly and catastrophically. Around 1595 BC, a completely unexpected threat appeared from far to the north. The Hittites, an Indo-European-speaking people based in central Anatolia, modern Turkey, had been building their own kingdom far from Mesopotamian centers. Under an ambitious ruler named Mursili I, Hittite forces marched over 500 miles from their homeland in a raid of unprecedented scale. The Babylonians, focused on traditional threats from the east and south, were utterly unprepared for this northern attack. The Hittites breached Babylon's defenses, plundered its treasures, and overthrew the ruling dynasty that had governed for 3 centuries. After this devastating raid, the Hittites withdrew to their Anatolian homeland, apparently satisfied with booty rather than occupation. Into the power vacuum left by this shocking attack stepped another group that had been gradually increasing their influence in northern Mesopotamia, the Kassites. Originally from the Zagros Mountains, these people had been serving as mercenaries and settling in Babylonian territory for generations. After the Hittite raid, a Kassite leader seized the Babylonian throne, establishing a new dynasty that would rule for an extraordinary 400 years. Though politically transformative, the Hittite attack and Kassite takeover did not disrupt cultural continuity. The newcomers adopted Babylonian religion, language, and customs. They preserved and continued administrative practices, literary traditions, and architectural styles. Many later Mesopotamians would look back on the era of Hammurabi as a golden age, a time when justice prevailed and the region stood united under enlightened rule from the city that would remain its cultural heart for millennia to come. After the dramatic Hittite raid that toppled the dynasty of Hammurabi, a new group assumed control of Babylon and its territories. The Kassites, originally mountain dwellers from the Zagros range to the east, had been gradually integrating into Mesopotamian society for generations, serving as mercenaries, settling in rural areas, and adopting local customs. Seizing the opportunity created by the power vacuum, a Kassite leader named Agum II claimed the throne, establishing what would become the longest ruling dynasty in Mesopotamian history. Unlike previous conquerors who imposed dramatic changes, these newcomers embraced the cultural and religious traditions of the land they now ruled. They adopted the titles, gods, and administrative practices of their predecessors. Under their governance, the region experienced remarkable stability, with the Kassite dynasty maintaining control for nearly 4 centuries. From approximately 1595 to 1155 BC. Little is known about the early decades of Kassite rule, as contemporary records are sparse. By the mid-15th century BC, however, historical documentation becomes more abundant, revealing a kingdom that, while smaller than Hammurabi's empire, maintained control over the Babylonian heartland and conducted sophisticated diplomatic relations with neighboring powers. The political landscape of the Near East had transformed dramatically during this period. No single power dominated the region. Instead, several major kingdoms coexisted in what historians call the Club of Great Powers, a system of balanced rivalries and alliances that maintained regional stability. Alongside the Kassite rulers of Babylon stood the new kingdom of Egypt, the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, the Mitanni Kingdom in northern Syria, and later, the Middle Assyrian Kingdom. International relations among these powers followed established diplomatic protocols. Royal letters, written on clay tablets in the Akkadian language, the diplomatic lingua franca of the era, addressed foreign rulers as brother, suggesting nominal equality. Royal marriages cemented political alliances, with princesses sent to foreign courts accompanied by elaborate dowries. Merchants and ambassadors traveled established routes between capitals, facilitating both trade and diplomacy. The Amarna letters, a diplomatic archive discovered in Egypt, includes correspondence between Kassite kings and Egyptian pharaohs, revealing the complex balance of cooperation and competition that characterized international relations. One Kassite ruler complained to Pharaoh Amenhotep III that the gold sent as a diplomatic gift was insufficient. "Gold in your country is as common as dust," he wrote, requesting more generous offerings to fund his building projects. Within their realm, Kassite monarchs ruled through an administrative system, adapted from earlier models, but with distinctive innovations. They introduced a new approach to land management, granting large estates to loyal supporters through officially documented kudaru stones. Boundary markers, inscribed with the grant's details and divine symbols, invoking curses on anyone who might violate the arrangement. This system created a form of feudal relationship between the crown and a class of landed nobility. Religious practices reflected both continuity and evolution. Traditional Mesopotamian deities remained central to state cult, but the Kassites introduced some of their own gods into the pantheon. They paid particular attention to cosmic deities associated with celestial bodies, contributing to the development of increasingly sophisticated astronomical observations. The intellectual achievements of this era were significant despite limited military expansion. Scribal schools preserved and elaborated older literary traditions. Scholars compiled comprehensive lists organizing knowledge about everything, from divine names to medical diagnoses, from legal precedents to grammatical forms. These systematic collections represented early attempts at encyclopedic knowledge organization. Astronomical observation became increasingly precise during this period. Court astrologers tracked planetary movements to identify omens relevant to royal decisions. These observations, initially driven by divinatory purposes, accumulated into datasets that would eventually enable mathematical prediction of celestial events. The zodiacal system, dividing the ecliptic into 12 segments named for constellations, began taking recognizable form during this era. Medical texts from the period reveal a dual approach to healing, combining empirical treatments, herbal remedies, surgical procedures, and dietary recommendations, with spiritual interventions addressing divine or demonic causes of illness. Diagnostic manuals linked observed symptoms to prognoses and appropriate treatments, showing sophisticated clinical observation, despite limited understanding of internal physiology. Artistic traditions displayed technical mastery within established conventions. The distinctive Kassite style in cylinder seals featured precisely carved figures with elaborate detail. Monumental art continued earlier traditions while incorporating subtle new elements from various cultural influences. Glass production reached new levels of sophistication, with colorful vessels created for luxury markets. Babylon itself flourished as the administrative and cultural center of the kingdom. Though smaller than during its imperial height under Hammurabi, the city remained a magnificent urban center, with impressive temples, bustling markets, and diverse neighborhoods. The Kassites renovated the Great Temple of Marduk repeatedly, maintaining Babylon's status as a preeminent religious center. Throughout their long reign, the Kassite rulers maintained generally peaceful relations with neighboring powers, preferring diplomacy to military conquest. When conflicts did arise, they typically involved frontier regions or responded to external aggression rather than representing expansionist ambitions. This relatively peaceful approach contributed to the dynasty's longevity, but eventually left them vulnerable to more militaristic neighbors. To the north, a resurgent Assyria gradually expanded its territory under ambitious rulers like Adad-nirari I and Shalmaneser I. Once a commercial city-state focused on trade networks, Assyria evolved into an aggressive territorial state with a formidable military. By the 13th century BC, Assyrian forces began challenging Kassite control of northern Mesopotamia. The balanced system of great powers began unraveling around 1200 BC, when a series of dramatic upheavals transformed the Near Eastern landscape. The Hittite Empire collapsed suddenly, with its capital Hattusa destroyed and abandoned. Egyptian power contracted amid internal problems and the mysterious Sea Peoples' raids. Trade networks disintegrated, and many urban centers declined or were abandoned entirely. The causes of this widespread disruption remain debated among historians. Climate change may have triggered crop failures and famine. Population movements brought new groups into conflict with established powers. Whatever the precise combination of factors, the result was a period of instability that historians call the Bronze Age collapse, a systemic failure of the political and economic structures that had maintained regional order. Amid this turbulence, the Kassite kingdom initially showed remarkable resilience, outlasting several of its great power contemporaries. However, mounting pressures eventually proved overwhelming. Elamite forces from southwestern Iran conducted increasingly destructive raids into Babylonian territory. The Elamite king, Shutruk Nahunta, led a devastating campaign around 1160 BC, capturing important cities and carrying off cultural treasures, including the victory stele of Naram Sin and the law code of Hammurabi. This Elamite invasion fatally weakened Kassite control. A native Babylonian dynasty, originating from the ancient southern city of Isin, seized power around 1155 BC, ending 4 centuries of Kassite rule. The second dynasty of Isin attempted to restore Babylonian greatness through renewed building projects and aggressive campaigns against Elam, achieving some success under kings like Nebuchadnezzar the Fum, who recovered stolen divine statues and cultural artifacts. Despite the political transition, cultural continuity persisted. The Kassite period left an enduring legacy in Babylonian civilization. Their long, relatively stable rule had allowed for intellectual and cultural development even without dramatic territorial expansion. The systematic organization of knowledge, astronomical observations, land management systems, and artistic traditions established during their reign would influence Mesopotamian civilization for centuries to come. As the Bronze Age gave way to the Iron Age around 1000 BC, new powers and peoples would reshape the geopolitical landscape of Mesopotamia once again. Yet the cultural foundations established during the Kassite period, building upon millennia of previous development, provided a resilient framework that would enable Babylonian civilization to survive dramatic political changes and eventually experience another renaissance under future dynasties. While Babylon experienced centuries of relative stability under Kassite rule, a formidable power was developing in the northern reaches of Mesopotamia. In the land watered by the upper Tigris River, with its rolling hills and rain-fed agriculture, the Assyrians crafted a society defined by military prowess, administrative efficiency, and ruthless determination. Originally centered around the ancient trading city of Asha, from which they took their name, these northern people had long maintained commercial networks connecting Anatolia, the Mediterranean, and southern Mesopotamia. Their experience as middlemen in international trade gave them broad awareness of distant regions and resources, knowledge that would later serve imperial ambitions. The transition from trading city-state to expansionist power began gradually during the 14th century BC. Early rulers, like Ashur-uballit-Tethyawan, circa 1363 to 1328 BC, asserted independence from neighboring powers and began intervening in regional politics. In a letter to the Egyptian pharaoh, this monarch proudly declared himself a great king, claiming equal status with other major powers. a dramatic shift from Assyria's previous position as a minor player. Military expansion accelerated under subsequent rulers. Adad-nirari I and Shalmaneser I extended territorial control in the 13th century BC, establishing provinces governed directly by appointed officials rather than through vassal arrangements. While other regional powers collapsed during the Bronze Age disruptions, around 1200 BC, Assyria weathered the storm, though with temporary contraction of its territorial reach. A true turning point came during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser I, circa 1114 to 1076 BC. This energetic ruler conducted campaigns in all directions: north into the Armenian highlands, west to the Mediterranean coast, east into the Zagros Mountains, and south against Babylonian territory. His inscriptions boast of crossing the Euphrates 28 times to fight Western enemies and hunting lions as a royal sport, establishing twin motifs that would characterize Assyrian kingship: warrior and hunter. Following Tiglath-Pileser's death, Assyria entered a period of contraction, lasting nearly 2 centuries. External pressures from Aramean tribal groups combined with internal succession problems to limit territorial control. However, even during this time of reduced power, key institutions and cultural elements that would support later imperial growth continued developing. The foundations for extraordinary imperial expansion were laid during the 9th century BC. 3 rulers stand out as architects of Assyrian resurgence: Ashurnasirpal II, Shalmaneser III, and Shamshi-Adad V. Under their leadership, the mechanisms of empire were systematically developed and refined. Ashurnasirpal II, 883 to 859 BC, established a new capital at Kalhu, modern Nimrud, constructing a magnificent palace decorated with stone reliefs glorifying royal achievements. These visual narratives, portraying military conquests, royal hunts, and religious ceremonies, created a powerful propaganda tool that subsequent rulers would expand. The inauguration of this palace complex was celebrated with a banquet, reportedly hosting 69,574 guests over 10 days. An extraordinary display of wealth and organizational capacity. Military innovations transformed the Assyrian army into an unstoppable force. Iron weapons, having replaced bronze, provided technological advantage. Specialized units, charioteers, cavalry, archers, and siege engineers, worked in coordinated fashion. A corps of professional soldiers was supplemented by seasonal conscripts and auxiliaries from subject territories. Logistics received particular attention, with carefully planned supply chains supporting operations in distant regions. Administrative systems matched military sophistication. Conquered territories were organized into provinces governed by appointed officials answerable directly to the king. Local nobles from newly integrated regions might be incorporated into the imperial structure, but their sons were often brought to the Assyrian capital for education, and as hostages, ensuring their father's loyalty. Road networks, way stations, and messenger systems facilitated rapid communication throughout the realm. Perhaps most notorious was the calculated use of terror as a political tool. Royal inscriptions and palace reliefs explicitly depicted extreme punishments inflicted on rebels: flaying, impalement, and mass executions. Cities that resisted were razed, their populations deported to distant parts of the empire. While undoubtedly exaggerated for propaganda purposes, these accounts reflect a deliberate strategy of psychological warfare intended to discourage resistance. The empire expanded dramatically under Tiglath-Pileser III, 745 to 727 BC, a usurper who seized the throne and implemented sweeping reforms. He reorganized the provincial system, breaking larger provinces into smaller units to prevent governors from accumulating too much power. He expanded the practice of mass deportation, moving conquered populations throughout the empire to disrupt local identities and resistance potential. He also reformed the military, creating a larger standing army, less dependent on seasonal conscripts. Under Tiglath-Pileser III and his successors, particularly Sargon II, Sennacherib, and Esarhaddon, the empire reached unprecedented size, eventually encompassing most of the Middle East, from western Iran to central Egypt, from the Persian Gulf to central Anatolia. This vast territory incorporated diverse environments, economies, and populations, presenting enormous administrative challenges. The relationship between Assyria and Babylon illustrates the evolution of imperial strategy. Early Assyrian kings had treated Babylon with respect due to its ancient cultural prestige. Tiglath-Pileser III took the traditional approach of being crowned separately as king of Babylon under a different throne name. His son Shalmaneser V maintained this practice. When Sargon II usurped the throne in 722 BC, he continued the dual monarchy approach. His son Sennacherib, however, grew frustrated with repeated Babylonian rebellions supported by Elam. After suppressing multiple uprisings, Sennacherib lost patience in 689 BC and ordered the complete destruction of Babylon. A shocking decision, given the city's religious and cultural significance. Irrigation systems were destroyed, temples demolished, and divine statues carried off to Assyria. The sacred image of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, was held hostage in Assyria, preventing proper religious ceremonies. This radical approach proved counterproductive, generating religious horror throughout the region and within Assyria itself. Sennacherib's assassination in 681 BC, reportedly while praying in a temple, was widely interpreted as divine punishment for his sacrilege against Babylon. His son, Esarhaddon, reversed this policy completely, ordering the full reconstruction of Babylon as one of his first royal acts. This pragmatic ruler recognized that ideology and religious respect could be more effective than brutality in maintaining control. Esarhaddon's inscriptions emphasize his role as restorer and builder rather than destroyer. He carefully maintained distinct cultural identities for Assyria and Babylonia while keeping both under his control. Esarhaddon also accomplished what his predecessors had attempted without success: the conquest of Egypt. In 671 BC, Assyrian forces captured Memphis, ancient capital of Lower Egypt, and established control over the Nile Delta region. This striking achievement extended Assyrian power to its greatest territorial extent, creating a multi-continental empire. The final major Assyrian ruler, Ashurbanipal, 668 to 627 BC, presided over the empire at its cultural and territorial peak. Unusually for an Assyrian king, he boasted of his literacy and scholarly abilities, alongside military prowess. Under his patronage, the library at Nineveh collected texts from throughout Mesopotamia, preserving literary, religious, scientific, and historical works on some 30,000 clay tablets, an invaluable collection that, ironically, was preserved for modern discovery precisely because of the violent destruction that would soon engulf the Assyrian capitals. Despite outward appearances of invincibility, the massive empire faced mounting structural problems. Controlling such vast territory required enormous military and administrative resources. Constant warfare, though generating plunder and tribute, strained manpower and economic sustainability. Subject populations, repeatedly relocated and exploited, harbored deep resentment toward Assyrian rule. The system maintained momentum under Ashurbanipal's strong leadership, but his death around 627 BC revealed the fragility beneath the impressive imperial facade. Succession disputes weakened central authority at precisely the moment when external threats were mounting. Babylon, under a Chaldean dynasty led by Nabopolassar, declared independence in 626 BC. Initially, this revolt seemed like just another of the periodic Babylonian rebellions that Assyrian forces had suppressed many times before. However, Nabopolassar proved an exceptionally determined and capable leader. Even more dangerously for Assyria, he formed an alliance with the Medes, an Iranian people who had developed a powerful kingdom in the Zagros Mountains. This Babylonian-Median alliance attacked the Assyrian heartland directly, targeting the great cities that had served as imperial capitals. Ashur fell in 614 BC, followed by Nineveh in 612 BC after a 3-month siege. The magnificent palaces and temples were put to the torch, their walls toppled, their treasures looted. A remnant Assyrian court established at Haran held out briefly, but by 609 BC, Assyrian independence had been completely extinguished. The fall of Assyria was as dramatic as its rise. An empire that had dominated the Near East for centuries vanished with such finality that within 2 generations, the great capital cities lay abandoned, their once magnificent buildings reduced to overgrown mounds. The prophet Nahum's exultant description of Nineveh's fall, "Woe to the city of blood, full of lies," reflected the deep hatred Assyria's imperial practices had engendered among subject peoples. Yet even in destruction, Assyria left an enduring legacy. The imperial systems developed to control vast territories, provided models for subsequent empires. The network of roads, administrative centers, and communication systems created military and economic integration across previously fragmented regions. The practice of gathering and preserving knowledge from throughout the empire saved countless cultural and literary works for posterity. And perhaps most importantly, the Assyrian Empire represented the first successful attempt to create a genuinely international political order, encompassing numerous peoples, languages, and traditions under unified governance. A complex achievement, despite the brutality of its methods. From the ashes of Assyrian domination arose a revitalized Babylonian state that would create one final magnificent chapter in Mesopotamian civilization. The Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean Empire, though lasting less than a century, achieved such cultural splendor and historical significance that it permanently secured Babylon's place in the world's imagination. The foundation for this renaissance was laid by Nabopolassar, a leader from the Chaldean tribal groups that had settled in southern Mesopotamia. Taking advantage of Assyria's weakening grip, he declared independence in 626 BC and gradually consolidated control over the southern regions. His strategic alliance with the Medes provided the military strength needed to challenge Assyrian dominance directly, leading to the dramatic fall of Nineveh in 612 BC. With Assyria's collapse, Nabopolassar faced the challenge of rebuilding a state that had experienced centuries of foreign domination. He began reconstruction projects in major cities, reorganized administrative systems, and balanced competing interests among traditional Babylonian urban elites and his own Chaldean tribal supporters. By the time of his death, in 605 BC, he had established a stable foundation upon which his son would build an extraordinary legacy. That son, Nebuchadnezzar II, would become the defining figure of this era, a monarch whose 43-year reign transformed Babylon into the most magnificent city in the ancient world. Taking the throne upon his father's death, the young king had already demonstrated military prowess as a crown prince. leading armies against Egyptian forces attempting to fill the vacuum left by Assyria's fall. Nebuchadnezzar's early campaigns secured the western territories of the former Assyrian Empire, extending Babylonian control through Syria and Palestine to the Egyptian border. His fateful siege of Jerusalem in 597 BC, followed by a more devastating conquest in 587 BC, led to the destruction of the Hebrew temple and the exile of the Judean elite to Babylon. A pivotal event in Jewish history, described poignantly in biblical texts and remembered in the famous lines, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion." Having secured his borders through decisive military action, Nebuchadnezzar turned his primary attention to internal development and monumental construction projects. The wealth flowing into imperial coffers from tribute, trade, and agriculture funded an ambitious building program that would transform Babylon into a wonder of the ancient world. The city was already ancient, with a history stretching back nearly 2 millennia. But Nebuchadnezzar reimagined it on an unprecedented scale. Massive new walls, reportedly so thick that a 4-horse chariot could turn around on their top, encircled an urban expanse of more than 850 hectares. A network of canals and quays managed water flow from the Euphrates, which ran through the heart of the city. Wide processional ways, paved with limestone and decorated with glazed brick reliefs of lions, dragons, and bulls, connected the major religious and administrative centers. Most spectacular of all was the temple complex dedicated to Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. At its heart stood the ziggurat Etemenanki, rising in 7 colored tiers to a height of over 90 meters, the likely inspiration for the biblical Tower of Babel. Beside it stood a Sagala, the main temple housing the golden statue of Marduk, and treasures accumulated from conquered regions. The royal palace complex matched the temples in grandeur. Multiple courtyards, audience halls, and administrative buildings formed a city within the city. Here, according to Greek tradition, Nebuchadnezzar built the famous Hanging Gardens, irrigated terraces filled with exotic plants and trees, supposedly to comfort his Median wife, who missed the greenery of her mountainous homeland. While archaeological evidence for these gardens remains elusive, the very fact that they became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world demonstrates Babylon's powerful grip on the imagination of subsequent civilizations. The annual New Year's festival, Akitu, represented the pinnacle of Babylonian religious and political theater. During this 11-day celebration, the creation epic Enuma Elish was recited, recounting Marduk's victory over primordial chaos and establishment of cosmic order. The king played a central ritual role, symbolically subordinating his earthly authority to divine power. In a dramatic ceremony, the high priest would strike the king's face and force him to kneel before Marduk's statue, a ritual humiliation demonstrating that even the most powerful earthly ruler served at divine pleasure. Beyond the capital, Nebuchadnezzar undertook extensive infrastructure projects throughout his realm. Irrigation systems were expanded and renovated, increasing agricultural productivity. Temples in ancient religious centers like Uruk, and Sippara were restored. Trade routes were secured with military outposts and way stations. The overall effect was a revitalization of Mesopotamian economic and cultural life after the disruptions of the late Assyrian period. Intellectually, the next Babylonian period saw significant achievements, particularly in astronomy. Court scholars refined observational techniques developed over previous centuries, creating increasingly accurate methods for predicting celestial events. The motivation remained primarily religious. understanding divine intentions through celestial omens. But the mathematical sophistication involved laid foundations for later scientific astronomy. Literary culture flourished as well, with scribal schools maintaining ancient texts while creating new compositions. The Babylonian creation epic reached its final form during this period, synthesizing older traditions into a coherent theological statement about divine kingship and cosmic order. Historical texts recorded royal achievements, while practical manuals transmitted specialized knowledge in fields ranging from medicine to engineering. Extensive administrative records painted a picture of a complex economic system, combining state-managed resources with private enterprise. Temple and palace organizations controlled vast agricultural estates, workshops, and trade operations. Simultaneously, private families conducted independent businesses, with some developing into powerful banking houses that financed commercial ventures and agricultural development through sophisticated credit arrangements. Nebuchadnezzar's death in 562 BC revealed a hidden weakness in the seemingly mighty empire: the absence of institutional structures capable of managing succession and maintaining stability beyond the life of a dominant personality. His son, Amel-Marduk, evil Merodach in biblical sources, ruled briefly before being overthrown by Neriglissar, a military officer who had married into the royal family. After Neriglissar's short reign, his young son was quickly deposed in favor of Nabonidus, whose relationship to the royal family remains unclear. This unusual figure would become the last native ruler of independent Babylon, presiding over its final years with policies that generated increasing internal opposition. Nabonidus showed particular devotion to Sin, the moon god, elevating this deity's status in ways that disturbed the powerful priests of Marduk, who had enjoyed premier status under previous rulers. Even more controversially, Nabonidus spent 10 years of his 17-year reign in the Arabian oasis of Timur, leaving his son Belshazzar as regent in Babylon. The reasons for this extraordinary absence from the capital remain debated. Perhaps commercial interests, religious motivations, or health concerns played roles. Whatever the explanation, this unprecedented arrangement weakened central authority and alienated key constituencies within Babylonian society. The priests of Marduk, aristocratic families, and urban elites grew increasingly dissatisfied with what they viewed as religious deviation and neglect of traditional ceremonies. Meanwhile, a new power was rising beyond the empire's eastern borders. The Persians, led by Cyrus II, later called the Great, had been consolidating control over the Iranian plateau, overthrowing their former Median overlords and creating a formidable new kingdom. In 539 BC, Persian forces approached Babylon after defeating outlying garrisons. The biblical account of the city's fall, featuring the famous writing on the wall interpreted by the prophet Daniel, suggests a night of feasting and revelry interrupted by enemy intrusion. Archaeological and contemporary Persian sources tell a different story. Babylon surrendered with minimal resistance, and Cyrus entered the city as a respectful liberator rather than a destructive conqueror. His famous cylinder inscription, discovered by modern archaeologists, portrays him as chosen by Marduk to restore proper worship and just governance after Nabonidus's alleged neglect. Whether through divine will or political calculation, this relatively peaceful transition preserved Babylon's physical splendor while ending its political independence. The Neo-Babylonian Empire became a wealthy province within the even larger Persian Empire, which would establish new paradigms for multicultural governance. Thus concluded the final chapter of truly independent Mesopotamian civilization. Though Babylon would continue as an important administrative center for centuries under Persian, Greek, and Parthian rule, indigenous political traditions had reached their conclusion. The legacy of this brief but brilliant Neo-Babylonian Renaissance would endure, however, not only in archaeological remains but in cultural memory. From biblical narratives of exile and prophetic visions to Greek historical accounts, from the wonders of the ancient world to the symbolic power of Babylon in art and literature across millennia. The year 539 BC marked a pivotal transition in Mesopotamian history. After 3 millennia of indigenous rule, punctuated by occasional outside invasions, the region between the rivers would now become part of a vast multicultural empire, centered outside its traditional boundaries. This transformation began not with violent destruction, but with a remarkably peaceful transfer of power that preserved Babylon's physical grandeur, while forever altering its political status. The agent of this historic change was Cyrus II of Persia, later called the Great, a ruler whose origins had seemed far from promising for world historical impact. The Persians had long existed as a collection of semi-nomadic tribes in the southern Zagros Mountains and Iranian Plateau, subordinate to more powerful neighbors. Under the leadership of Cyrus's ancestors, the Achaemenid clan had established a small kingdom centered on Anshan in southwestern Iran, nominally subject to Median overlordship. Cyrus's rise to power began with his overthrow of the Median Empire around 550 BC. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, Cyrus had been raised in secrecy after his maternal grandfather, the Median king Astyages, had dreamed that his grandson would usurp him. Despite attempts to eliminate the threat, the young man survived to fulfill the prophecy, overthrowing his grandfather and claiming the Median territories. With stunning rapidity, Cyrus transformed this initial success into a campaign of unprecedented conquest. Within a single decade, he gained control over most of Western Asia, incorporating the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia, the Greek cities of the Ionian coast, and various regions of the Iranian plateau. His military achievements combined innovative tactics with strategic flexibility, but perhaps his most distinctive characteristic was his approach to conquered peoples. Unlike earlier conquerors who imposed their cultural and religious practices while suppressing local traditions, Cyrus developed a revolutionary policy of cultural and religious tolerance. Conquered peoples retained their customs, local administrative systems, and religious practices. Persian imperial strategy focused on ensuring loyalty and tribute flow, while otherwise minimizing disruption to local societies. As this formidable new power expanded westward, the last Neo-Babylonian king, Nabonidus, found himself increasingly isolated politically and militarily. Having spent a decade in the Arabian oasis of Tama, for reasons that remain debated, Nabonidus had returned to Babylon to find his religious policies and governing approach sharply criticized by influential groups within the society. His particular devotion to Sin, the moon god, had alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk, traditionally Babylon's patron deity. His apparent neglect of certain religious festivals, particularly the crucial New Year's celebration, generated theological concerns about cosmic order. Meanwhile, various conquered peoples within the Babylonian realm harbored resentments over restrictive policies, creating potential allies for any invader promising more tolerant rule. As Persian forces approached Babylonian territory in 539 BC, they encountered a deeply divided society. Some frontier garrisons resisted, while others quickly surrendered. Nabonidus gathered troops to meet the threat, but the expected decisive battle never materialized. Instead, Persian forces under the command of Cyrus's general Ugbaru conducted a brilliant maneuver, diverting river waters to lower the Euphrates enough for troops to enter Babylon beneath its massive walls. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a contemporary Babylonian text, describes the city's fall in remarkably undramatic terms. In the month of Tashritu, when Cyrus attacked the army of Akkad in Opis on the Tigris, the inhabitants of Akkad revolted, but he massacred the confused inhabitants. The 14th day, Sippar was seized without battle. Nabonidus fled. The 16th day, Ugbaru, governor of Gutium, and the army of Cyrus entered Babylon without battle. Afterward, Nabonidus was arrested in Babylon when he returned. This account, with its emphasis on without battle, contrasts sharply with the catastrophic destructions that had ended many previous Mesopotamian regimes. The famous biblical account in the Book of Daniel, featuring the disembodied hand writing mysterious words on the palace wall during Belshazzar's feast, adds dramatic elements, but similarly emphasizes the city's fall without significant resistance. Cyrus himself arrived in Babylon shortly after its capture and implemented policies that would define Persian imperial governance for centuries. Rather than positioning himself as a foreign conqueror, he claimed the traditional Babylonian royal titles and portrayed himself as the legitimate successor to the ancient throne, chosen by Marduk to restore proper religious observance and just rule after Nabonidus's alleged failures. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscribed with the official Persian version of these events, represents one of history's earliest declarations of human rights policies. In this remarkable document, Cyrus describes his peaceful entry into Babylon, his concern for the city's well-being, and most significantly, his policy of allowing displaced peoples to return to their homelands and rebuild their religious institutions. This last policy had particular significance for the Jewish community. The biblical books of Ezra and Chronicles record that Cyrus issued a decree specifically allowing the Jewish exiles in Babylon to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, with expenses paid from the royal treasury. While only a portion of the exiles chose to return, this policy established Cyrus as a divinely appointed liberator in Jewish tradition, with the prophet Isaiah even referring to him as God's anointed one, Messiah. For Babylon itself, the Persian conquest marked the beginning of a new status, no longer an imperial capital, but a wealthy provincial center within a far larger political entity. The city retained its splendor, religious importance, and economic vitality. Its administrative systems and scribal traditions continued, now serving Persian imperial needs. Many Babylonian elites found places within the new imperial administration, applying their skills in service to their new overlords. The Persian Empire, created by Cyrus and expanded by his successors, represented a new model of imperial organization. Divided into provinces called satrapies, each under a governor, satrap, typically drawn from Persian nobility, the empire balanced central control with local autonomy. A common imperial administrative language, Aramaic, standardized coinage, and an impressive road network facilitated governance across vast distances. Religious policy remained true to Cyrus's original approach. Local cults and practices continued without interference, while the Persian rulers participated in traditional ceremonies when visiting major centers like Babylon. The Achaemenid kings themselves practiced Zoroastrianism, an Iranian faith emphasizing the cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood, but they did not impose this religion on subject peoples. Under Persian rule, Mesopotamia experienced generally stable governance for 2 centuries. The region's agricultural productivity and commercial wealth made it among the most valuable provinces of the empire. Babylonian astronomical knowledge administrative expertise, and cultural traditions influenced Persian imperial practices, while Persian military protection and inclusion in an empire stretching from the Indus to the Mediterranean created new opportunities for merchants and officials. Occasional rebellions did occur, particularly during succession disputes within the Achaemenid dynasty. Babylon revolted twice during the troubled accession of Darius III, around 522 BC, and again after the death of Xerxes in 465 BC. These uprisings were suppressed with varying degrees of severity, but never led to the wholesale destruction that had characterized the Assyrian response to rebellion. The Achaemenid dynasty ruled Mesopotamia until 331 BC, when Alexander the Great defeated the last Persian king, Darius III, and claimed the vast empire for himself. With his victory, Hellenistic culture would be introduced to the ancient land between the rivers, beginning yet another chapter in its long history. But the pivotal moment in this transition had come 2 centuries earlier, when Cyrus the Great entered Babylon and established a new paradigm of multicultural empire that would influence political thinking for millennia to come. The Persian conquest marked the definitive end of truly independent Mesopotamian political systems, but paradoxically ensured the preservation and transmission of Mesopotamian cultural achievements. By incorporating rather than destroying local traditions, the Persian Empire created conditions where ancient knowledge could be maintained and eventually transmitted to new civilizations, ensuring that the legacy of the land between the rivers would endure long after its political independence had passed into history. The Persian conquest in 539 BC marked the beginning of a long twilight for the ancient civilization between the rivers, while Mesopotamian cities, particularly Babylon, would continue to exist for many centuries. Indeed, some settlements in the region have maintained continuous habitation into the modern era. The distinctive cultural tradition that had developed over 3 millennia underwent a gradual transformation under successive waves of foreign rule. The Persian period ranging 539 and 331 BC treated Mesopotamian traditions with considerable respect. Achaemenid kings participated in traditional Babylonian religious ceremonies when visiting the city, maintained the ancient temples, and incorporated local elites into their administrative systems. Babylonian astronomical knowledge, with its sophisticated mathematical foundations, influenced Persian understanding of the cosmos. Cultural continuity remained strong during these 2 centuries, even as political independence had been lost. A more dramatic shift began with the arrival of Alexander the Great, who defeated the Persian forces under Darius III in 331 BC. After this victory, the Macedonian conqueror entered Babylon in triumph, receiving an enthusiastic welcome from a population, perhaps hoping for liberation from Persian rule. Alexander apparently appreciated the city's historical importance. He planned to make Babylon the capital of his new Eastern Empire, and began ambitious restoration projects for its temples and palaces. However, Alexander's premature death in 323 BC in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon itself triggered a prolonged power struggle among his generals. This conflict eventually resulted in Mesopotamia falling under the control of Seleucus, who established what historians call the Seleucid Empire, a vast realm stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Rather than ruling from Babylon, Seleucus founded a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, about 90 kilometers north of the ancient city. This new Greek-style polis, with its grid-planned streets, theaters, gymnasiums, and administrative centers, represented a deliberate attempt to implant Hellenistic culture in the heart of the ancient land. Many residents of Babylon gradually relocated to the new city, drawn by economic opportunities and tax incentives, beginning a slow decline in the ancient capital's population and importance. Under Seleucid rule, a complex cultural fusion began developing. Greek became the administrative language, and Greek architectural styles, artistic conventions, and religious practices were introduced throughout the region. Simultaneously, traditional Mesopotamian temples continued operating. Cuneiform writing persisted for religious and astronomical texts, and ancient literary works were still copied and studied in specialized scribal centers. This Greco-Mesopotamian synthesis is particularly evident in intellectual developments of the period. Babylonian astronomical traditions, with their emphasis on mathematical prediction of celestial movements, influenced Greek theoretical models of the cosmos. Simultaneously, Greek philosophical approaches affected how Babylonian scholars interpreted their ancient traditions. Berossus, a Babylonian priest, composed a Greek-language history of his homeland for Seleucid ruler Antiochus I, translating Mesopotamian traditions into forms comprehensible to a Hellenistic audience. The Hellenistic era in Mesopotamia saw gradual religious transformations as well. Traditional temple cults continued, but with decreasing state support compared to previous eras. Greek deities were sometimes identified with Mesopotamian counterparts: Zeus with Marduk, Apollo with Narbu, Artemis with Ishtar, creating syncretistic worship patterns. Simultaneously, new religious movements, including Eastern mystery cults, philosophical schools, and astral religions, gained adherents in the cosmopolitan cities of the region. Political control shifted again in the late Seleucid period, as the empire weakened through internal dynastic conflicts and external pressures. The Parthians, an Iranian people from Central Asia, gradually expanded westward, capturing the eastern provinces of the Seleucid realm, and eventually taking Mesopotamia itself around 141 BC. Their arrival marked another stage in the region's transformation. The Parthian period represented a partial return to Eastern cultural patterns after the Hellenistic interlude. While Greek remained an important administrative and cultural language, Aramaic gained increasing prominence, and Iranian cultural elements became more visible in art and royal ideology. The Parthians followed a decentralized governing approach, allowing considerable autonomy to local authorities, including Greek-style city councils and traditional temple administrations. During this era, Babylon continued its slow decline, though still inhabited and maintaining some religious significance. It had been eclipsed by newer urban centers. Seleucia on the Tigris flourished as the region's primary city, with Ctesiphon across the river emerging as the Parthian administrative center. Uruk, one of the oldest Mesopotamian cities, maintained surprising vitality, with its main temple complex dedicated to Ishtar remaining active well into the Parthian period. Culturally, the Parthian era saw the final phases of cuneiform writing, which had been the primary script of Mesopotamia for over 3,000 years. The latest known cuneiform astronomical text dates to AD 75, while the latest precisely dated literary text comes from 35 BC. This gradual abandonment of the ancient writing system marked a decisive break in cultural continuity. Though many Mesopotamian traditions continued in translated forms or through oral transmission, religious developments during this period included the spread of Judaism throughout Mesopotamia, with important communities developing in major cities. The Babylonian Jewish community descended from those who had remained after the Persian authorized return to Jerusalem, became increasingly influential in Jewish religious thought. The beginnings of what would later develop into the Babylonian Talmud. a massive collection of rabbinic discussions on Jewish lore and ethics, took shape during these centuries. The final major imperial transition came when the Sasanian Persians overthrew Parthian rule in AD 224, establishing a more centralized and assertive Iranian state. Under Sasanian governance, AD 224 to 651 in Mesopotamia, Zoroastrianism received strong state support, occasionally resulting in pressure on other religious communities. Administrative systems became more hierarchical, with increased tax demands and labor obligations placed on the population. Ctesiphon reached its peak as one of the world's greatest cities during this period, serving as the winter capital of the Sasanian Empire. Its legendary palace, with its enormous vaulted hall, stood as an architectural marvel that would influence Islamic building traditions centuries later. Other Mesopotamian cities continued functioning, though often at reduced size compared to earlier eras. The cultural landscape during these final centuries of pre-Islamic Mesopotamia was extraordinarily diverse. Mandaeans practiced their distinctive baptismal religion in southern marshlands. Manichaean missionaries spread their dualistic faith from Mesopotamian bases. Eastern Christianity established important centers, with the Church of the East, often called Nestorian by outsiders, developing distinctive theological traditions and missionary networks reaching as far as China. Jewish scholarly communities in Mesopotamia produced the Babylonian Talmud, completed around AD 500, which would become the most authoritative legal and ethical compilation in Rabbinic Judaism. Simultaneously, in dwindling temples, the last priests maintaining ancient Mesopotamian religious traditions continued their increasingly isolated practices, their numbers diminishing with each generation. This diverse religious landscape was transformed again by the Arab-Islamic conquests of the 630 and 640. After defeating Sasanian forces in the decisive Battle of Qadisiyah in 636, Arab armies gained control of Mesopotamia, which would become the heartland of the Abbasid Caliphate, when Baghdad was founded in 762. This new imperial center was built just 30 kilometers from the ruins of ancient Ctesiphon, continuing the pattern of successive capitals rising near the remains of their predecessors. Under Islamic rule, the region, now increasingly called Iraq, from the Persian Iraq, referring to the lowlands, experienced cultural revitalization, but within an entirely different tradition. The ancient gods of Sumer and Akkad had been largely forgotten. Cuneiform writing had been abandoned. The ziggurats and temples had crumbled to ruins, or been rebuilt as mosques and palaces. Yet subtle continuities persisted beneath the surface of these profound changes. Astronomical and mathematical knowledge developed over millennia in Mesopotamia influenced early Islamic science. Irrigation techniques refined since Sumerian times continued sustaining agriculture. Administrative practices and imperial ideologies transmitted through successive empires informed Islamic governance. Countless folk beliefs, literary motifs, and cultural practices continued in adapted forms, their ancient origins forgotten, but their influence persistent. The final disappearance of recognizably Mesopotamian cultural traditions is impossible to date precisely. Like a river flowing into marshlands, the distinctive civilization that had begun at Eridu and Uruk in the 4th millennium BC gradually dissipated, its waters mixing with countless other streams to nourish newer cultural growth. Elements of Mesopotamian heritage persisted in Jewish communities, in astronomical knowledge, in irrigation practices, and in countless unrecognized influences on successive civilizations. Modern archaeological excavations beginning in the 19th century gradually revealed the forgotten splendor of ancient Mesopotamia. Cuneiform writing was deciphered, ziggurats excavated, and royal palaces unearthed from beneath centuries of accumulated soil. The recognition that this region had produced the world's first cities, earliest writing, and pioneering legal codes transformed humanity's understanding of its own origins. Today, the physical legacy of ancient Mesopotamia remains embedded in the landscape of modern Iraq and Syria, in archaeological sites, museum collections, and the genetic and cultural heritage of contemporary inhabitants. Yet perhaps the most profound legacy lies in foundational concepts that shaped subsequent civilizations. The organization of urban communities, the development of writing for record-keeping and literature, the codification of laws, the practice of mathematics and astronomy, and the creation of complex religious systems seeking to explain humanity's place in the cosmos. The story of ancient Mesopotamia thus ends not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gradual transformation and diffusion of influence, a transition from direct cultural continuity to indirect legacy, from lived tradition to recovered memory. This pattern reflects the fundamental nature of human civilization itself, not discrete chapters with clear beginnings and endings, but an ongoing flow of influence and adaptation, with each generation building upon, modifying, and sometimes rediscovering the achievements of those who came before. As our journey through the long history of Mesopotamia draws to a close, we can now step back and contemplate the extraordinary legacy this civilization bestowed upon human development. The achievements that emerged from the land between the rivers continue to influence our world today in ways both obvious and subtle, recognized and forgotten. Writing, perhaps the most revolutionary technology in human history, found its first systematic expression in the simple clay tokens and pictographs of Uruk around 3400 BC. What began as a practical method for recording agricultural products and commercial transactions gradually evolved into a flexible system capable of expressing abstract thoughts, preserving literary works, codifying laws, and transmitting knowledge across generations. The cuneiform writing developed in Mesopotamia would influence or inspire many subsequent scripts, and the very concept of written communication would spread from this initial source to transform human societies worldwide. The organization of urban communities, with their specialized labor, civic infrastructure, and complex social hierarchies, crystallized in the early cities of Sumer. Here, humanity first grappled with problems still familiar today: how to govern dense populations, manage shared resources, regulate economic activities, and maintain social order amid competing interests. The solutions developed in these pioneering urban centers, from municipal councils to written laws, from tax systems to religious institutions as social anchors, established patterns that would be adapted and modified by countless subsequent societies. Mathematics and astronomy, driven initially by practical needs for land measurement, architectural planning, and calendar development, reached sophisticated levels in Mesopotamian scholarly traditions. The sexagesimal system, developed by Sumerian administrators based on units of 60, continues to shape how we measure time and angular geometry, even in our digital age. Every time we speak of 60 seconds in a minute, or 360 degrees in a circle, we echo calculations made by priests and scribes who observed the stars from Mesopotamian temple platforms thousands of years ago. Legal concepts fundamental to orderly society found early formal expression in Mesopotamian law codes. From Onamu to Hammurabi, these collections established principles of justice, procedures for resolving disputes, standards for commercial transactions, and protections for various social classes. While often harsh by modern standards, these codes represented a revolutionary advance. The concept that law should be publicly known, consistently applied, and derived from something beyond the ruler's momentary whim. This principle of established law, rather than arbitrary authority, underlies all modern legal systems. Religious and mythological frameworks developed in Mesopotamia influenced subsequent theological thinking throughout the Middle East and beyond. The flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh bears striking parallels to later biblical accounts. Concepts of divine justice, cosmic order versus chaos, and humanity's relationship with supernatural forces found expression in Mesopotamian religious texts that would echo through later faith traditions. Even aspects of religious practice, from priestly hierarchies to ritual purification, from sacred architecture to theological speculation, show influences traceable to Mesopotamian origins. Technological innovations from this ancient land transformed daily life and economic possibilities. Irrigation systems developed by Sumerian farmers allowed agriculture to flourish in semi-arid environments, dramatically increasing food production. The potter's wheel revolutionized ceramic manufacturing. Advances in metallurgy progressed from simple copper tools to sophisticated bronze alloys. Wheeled vehicles changed transportation possibilities. Glass production, textile manufacturing, and countless other crafts reached levels of refinement that would influence subsequent civilizations across multiple continents. Political organizations from city-states to territorial empires found early expression between the Tigris and Euphrates. The tensions between local autonomy and central authority, between traditional practices and administrative efficiency, between diverse populations and unifying governance. All these fundamental political challenges were confronted by Mesopotamian rulers from Sargon to Nebuchadnezzar. Their experiments in statecraft, both successful and failed, provided models and cautionary tales for subsequent political systems across the ancient world. Literary forms exploring fundamental human questions emerged in the world's earliest known creative texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh confronts mortality, friendship, and the search for meaning in the face of inevitable death. Wisdom literature offered reflections on justice and suffering that would find parallels in later works like the biblical Book of Job. Creation myths explored humanity's place in the cosmic order. Love poetry, royal hymns, proverb collections, and humorous tales all found expression in cuneiform texts, establishing narrative and poetic traditions that would influence subsequent literatures. Perhaps most profoundly, Mesopotamia demonstrated humanity's capacity for cumulative cultural achievement, the ability to build upon previous generations' discoveries, to preserve and transmit knowledge, to adapt traditional practices to new circumstances, and to create institutions outlasting individual lifespans. This fundamental aspect of human civilization, our ability to stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, found its first sustained expression in the long cultural continuity between the rivers. When we trace these influences, we must acknowledge the complex nature of cultural transmission and parallel development. Some Mesopotamian innovations directly influence subsequent societies through documented contact and deliberate adoption. Others may represent independent solutions to universal human challenges, with similarities reflecting common problems rather than direct influence. In many cases, Mesopotamian practices reached later societies through multiple intermediaries, transformed through successive cultural translations. The relationship between ancient Mesopotamia and contemporary society resembles a mighty river, with countless tributaries and distributaries, some channels maintaining direct connection, others dividing and rejoining, through complex networks, some apparently disappearing underground, only to resurface in unexpected locations. The waters that first gathered in the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates have long since mingled with countless other streams, yet they remain part of the great flow of human civilization that continues to this day. As modern inhabitants of a world shaped by electricity, digital communication, and space exploration, we might easily dismiss these ancient achievements as primitive or irrelevant. Yet the fundamental challenges of human existence, creating sustainable food systems, establishing just societies, understanding our place in the cosmos, expressing our hopes and fears through art, and contemplating our mortality, remain as pressing today as they were for the inhabitants of Uruk or Babylon. The story of Mesopotamia reminds us that civilization is not a possession, but a process, not an achievement, but an ongoing project. It began long before any of us were born, and will continue long after we have returned to dust. We are inheritors of traditions, innovations, and wisdom, accumulated over thousands of years, with roots reaching back to those first farmers who settled beside the ancient rivers and began humanity's great experiment in creating something larger and more enduring than individual human lives. As we conclude our journey through the story of ancient Mesopotamia, we can appreciate how these distant ancestors, despite the vast gulf of time separating us, grappled with challenges recognizable to our modern sensibilities. In their triumphs and failures, their wisdom and blindness, their courage and cruelty, we can recognize reflections of our own humanity, reminding us that though the specific forms of civilization change dramatically across millennia, the fundamental human experiences of love and fear, wonder and uncertainty, creation and destruction remain remarkably constant. The legacy of Mesopotamia lives on, in our minutes and hours, in our written words, in our cities and laws, in our religious concepts and scientific inquiry, and in our continuing effort to find meaning and create beauty in a world that, like the unpredictable floods of the ancient rivers, remains perpetually changing and eternally challenging.